And he got his engineering degree there. Then he moved to Mannheim in Germany, where he did economics. Then eventually moved to Geneva in Switzerland, and he tells me that though Sigmund Freud comes from, well, actually he went to Vienna in Austria, where Freud comes from, but he said he did not get influenced by that fact. He was completely oblivious to Freud's looming presence in Vienna. So he came back, and then he came back to Germany, in Frankfurt, where he studied psychoanalysis. So he lives in Goa. He's a Maverick. He does not depend on UGC salary. And he, however, is an honorary and visiting professor in several universities all over the world. He writes extensively. His books and his lectures are highly, highly regarded. May I now, can't see anybody, I can see Sudhir Thakur. May I invite, are we all ready? Okay. May I invite Dr. Sudhir Thakur to give another dimension to Rabindranath Tagore, his paintings and perhaps the meanings behind his paintings. Sudhir Thakur.
Your Excellency, the Governor of West Bengal, Shri N.K. Narayanan, Mrs. Narayanan, the Vice Chancellor, Sushant Dasgupta, Mrs. Dasgupta, distinguished colleagues, I share the Governor's apprehension of talking about Tagore in this particular place where so many of you know much, much more than I do. I am not a scholar of Rabindranath Tagore, nor have I any expertise in matters relating to art. Along with many others, I truly believe that there is an ultimate mystery at the heart of great art, a beauty that can all too easily vanish if we seek to understand it too easily and too quickly. I am also cautioned by the painter himself, who wrote of his paintings, and I quote, "People often ask me about the meaning of my pictures. I remain silent, even as my pictures are. It is for them to express and not to explain." And at another place, I have nothing to say about my pictures. I do not really know what I have done or wanted to say. It would thus be presumptuous of me to try and explain Rabindranath's pictures in any authoritative fashion. All I can do here is to try and capture a glimpse of the mysterious creativity of his paintings through the impressions they have left on my own mind. In other words, it is not any scholarly apparatus, but my own psyche, which is the primary source of my observations. My own subconscious, with which I seek to understand the subconscious in some of Rabindranath's paintings, the landscapes and female portraits. My starting point then are the resonances in my own psyche to the mood and forms in his artwork. Only after a full experiencing of my emotional reactions and bringing them into consciousness do I go into the explanatory mode, using biographical and other information for a more conscious understanding of the paintings. My approach to art is similar or the same as that of the well-known Germanist Emil Steiger to poetics, zu begreifen, was uns ergreift, to grasp what has gripped us. I thus promise to be hopelessly subjective as I attempt to answer the question the surrealist André Breton asked in a different context. And he said, To me, a picture is a window that looks out on something. The question is, on what? My task today then is to muse together with you on the question, what do Rabindranath's paintings look out on? Given his reputation, based on his literary output, especially his poems and songs, of being a highly spiritual person, it would be easy to claim that the creativity Rabindranath displays in his art is fundamentally spiritual. This will not be erroneous, at least as far as some of his landscapes are concerned. These landscapes are indeed like many of his poems, meditative, simultaneously looking in and looking out. They recapture young Rabindranath's moments of quasi-mystical absorption in nature, such as when he writes in a letter, and I quote, "Shining expanse of river, the blur of shade thrown by the dark fringe of trees along its edge, and the white sky gleaming overhead in uncontrolled aloofness." Of these moments, of which he wrote so eloquently when traveling through the Bengal countryside, in his late 20s, he says, "My feelings seem to be those of our ancient earth in the daily ecstasy of its sun-kissed life. My own unconscious seems to stream through each blade of grass, each sucking root, to rise with the sap through the trees, to break out with joyous thrills in the waving field of corn, in the rustling palm leaves. I feel impelled to give expression to my blood tie with the earth, my kinsman love for her, but I'm afraid I shall not be understood." I believe it is significant that when in September 1937, Rabindranath was in a coma for 60 hours and almost died, his first creative act on coming back from the borderland between life and death was to ask for colors and a brush and paint a landscape. Dark trees outlined against a ghostly twilight beneath which glimmered irregular patches of white light with the hint of palest yellow. His landscapes, in which Tagore seems to try to recapture his blood tie with the earth, the painter is gazing into the nature with such an empathy, sahrdaya, that he seems to be connecting with the universe itself. For spiritual to me primarily means an omnipresence of empathy, of a deep feeling of connectedness. We are at our most divine when we are at our most empathetic. Perhaps only a few rare saints can reach the summit of empathy, expressed in the Upanishadic ideal of he who sees all beings in his own self and his own self in all beings. Most of us can consider ourselves fortunate if we can catch a glimpse of the peak from the base camp of an all-encompassing compassion that is so evident in Rabindranath's literary work, his songs, and some of his paintings. This view on the spiritual nature of his creativity, and indeed of all artistic creativity, will not only have influential support from theorists of Indian aesthetics from Abhinav Gupta to Ananda Kumaraswamy, but has also been articulated by many European artists, including influential modernists, as is evident from the catalogue of the exhibition Traces of the Spiritual in Centre Pompidou in Paris in 2008. To touch, refine, and enrich the soul, the spirit, has become a central concern for many artists today. They believe that one of the highest skills of the artistic profession is, and I quote, the ability to summon a vision of the divine without sentimentality, a secular divine. This secular divine, for me, as I said, is an all-encompassing empathy. Writers, too, have described the creative process where the sense of individual agency disappears in a fusion with the subject, the acme of empathy. Gustave Flaubert, while writing Madame Bovary, confides to a friend, "It is a delicious thing to write, to be no longer yourself, but to move in an entire universe of your own creating. Today, for instance, as a man and woman, both lover and mistress, I rode into a forest of an autumn afternoon under the yellow leaves. And I was also the horses, the leaves, the wind, the words my people uttered, even the red sun that made them close their love-drowned eyes. This is the literally equivalent of a painter meditating before the canvas. Or if you do not like the word meditating, then dreaming before the canvas. Someone like Paul Gauguin, who believed in what he called dreaming while fully awake before nature, and now before the canvas, letting the dreams suggest the painting and translation of the feeling into visual terms. Yet, excluding some of the landscapes, my abiding impressions of some of the other paintings, Rabindranath's paintings, is that their spirituality does not lie in their inspiration, but in their execution. If in Kumaraswamy's terms, artistic creativity is a two-step yoga comprising one of a meditative stance, mindfulness, and two of skilled execution, then the yoga of Rabindranath's paintings lies in their execution. The painter himself recognizes this particularity when he writes in a letter to Rani Mahalobis, the subject matter of a poem can be traced back to some dim thought in the mind. While painting, the process adopted by me is quite the reverse. First, there is the hint of a line. Then the line becomes a form. The more pronounced the form, the clearer becomes the picture of my conception. This creation of form is an endless wonder. The spiritual aspect of Rabindranath's art, especially in the landscapes, is thus not that of a meditating monk, but the arrow maker, who is often brought up in Indian philosophical texts as the proverbial instance of mindfulness. Thus, Shankaracharya, one of the greatest Indian philosophers, singles out the arrow maker who perceives nothing beyond his work when he is buried in it. At the beginning of this talk, I said that I will not dispute the presence of the spiritual in Rabindranath's artistic creativity when the child was young. Growing up in the vast, sprawling mansion in Jorsanko in the midst of great wealth and culture, and although surrounded by a busy extended family life, Ravi was a lonely child who was mainly brought up by poor and ignorant servants who were physically abusive. Later, he was to refer to his childhood as his days under servocracy. Although he loved nature and outdoors, the highly imaginative boy led a very restricted life in his living quarters, where he looked longingly out through the windows at the greenery, flowers, and trees in the garden, birds in the sky. In short, the freedom of nature. One servant in charge of Ravi, for instance, tried to keep the boy from exploring the outdoors by keeping him within a circle drawn on the ground. The feelings of loneliness and of being confined were exacerbated by the fact that he refused to go to school after class 5 and was educated at home by tutors. Following the example of many of his elder brothers who were educated in England, Rabindranath did go to England when he was 17 to study law and train as a barrister, but returned after 1.5 years without finishing his studies. Ravi's one intimate companion in the years of his childhood and early youth, till his marriage at the age of 22, was his sister-in-law, Kadambari Devi, the wife of a much older brother, Jyotindranath. Kadambari came to Tagore's household as a 9-year-old child bride, 2 years older than Ravi, and shared her childhood and adolescence with him. They played together, read together, sang together, creating a two-person universe for themselves. Kadambari committed suicide 4 months after Rabindranath's marriage at the age of 22. I will come back to this later. As we know, Rabindranath came to painting late, when he was almost 70 years old. The immediate precursor of his paintings were the Puravi poems, which he wrote during an ocean crossing from Cherbourg to Buenos Aires. During the voyage, we are told, he was violently ill and his mind was, quote, despondent with the saddest thoughts of tragedy of love and death. With a weakening of normal psychological defenses that keep a lid on the cauldron of our subconscious impulses, the cut-off parts of the self bubbled up through many lines in the first drafts of these poems, which Rabindranath then erased and formed into shapes which he called apparitions of non-deliberate origin. In one poem in Purvi, he directly refers to these drawings. Hark, where in the formless limbs ghosts of sights and weepings haunt the night. A time was when they had a form and a voice. The fruitless sorrow of all that has been and is now nameless, amorphous, unremembered, haunt the dim recesses of my mind, seeking a form, a shelter. Not that he had not earlier used the same technique of erasing lines from poems and transforming the erasures into rhythmic visual shapes. But as Kshitish Roy perceptively observes, the important difference now is, and I quote him, that while the earlier erasures mostly assumed delicately floriated or vine-like patterns, the ones of Puravi often show an orgy of violent forms, grotesque and primitive shapes that are almost in conflict with the words and the lines, and at times very nearly obliterating a whole stanza or a complete poem. From Puravi onwards, under a greater pressure from subconscious promptings, poetry recedes and painting comes more and more to the fore. The poet Tagore cedes his place to the painter Rabindranath. From the same letter to Rani Manlobis, from which I quoted earlier, he writes, "The most important item in the bulletin of my daily news is my painting. I am hopelessly entangled in the spell that the lines have cast all around me. I have almost managed to forget that there used to be a time when I wrote poetry." Is painting, the psychoanalyst would ask, more therapeutic than poetry in a situation where the balance between the mud and the sun has shifted in favor of the former? Do the disturbances caused by the greater play of the subconscious require a stronger medicine?
Yesterday was an exciting day of insightful papers. We'll start today's session with two papers, and in the chair for the business session 2 is Professor G. Subbaiah. And I invite the first speaker of this session, Rukmini Banerjee. The title of her paper is Reading and Young Children, the Inspiration from Visva-Bharati in North India. Rukmini Banerjee has been with Pratham for over 15 years. Pratham is a non-government organization that works to ensure that every child is in school and learning well. I invite Rukmini Banerjee to the dais.
Sunday morning hall khali thake setai thik. This indicates that people in Shantiniketan have better things to do than to listen to lectures. I'm very honored that I have been invited to speak here. Since yesterday, we've been listening to very many eminent people. I don't think I've heard, since I left university many years ago, I don't think I've heard as many eminent professors speak on a whole variety of subjects. And I'm also very aware that, as somebody said yesterday, that there are many Tagore scholars in the audience. So with all this background, I'm quite intimidated to actually speak here. So what I thought I would do is to speak a little bit about some evidence and then some experiences that I've had and my team has had in this business of how children can learn to read and the inspiration that we have got from Visva-Bharati. Yesterday people spoke about many different things that Tagore has written, but I noticed that in the whole program nobody will speak about the things he actually wrote, not just writing for children, but actually thinking about what children should learn in their early years. And so perhaps this can be a useful input. Very quick view on what do we know about schooling, about reading, and so on in India. In English, the the word is education. But as we know, in many Indian languages, not just in Bangla or Hindi, the common man uses the word lekha pada or padashuna, or in Hindi padhai. And therefore, I think there is not a distinction made in most Indian languages, in most commonplace discussions about the difference between schooling and learning. In formal discussions, even in Hindi or in Bangla or in any other language, there is words like shiksha and vidya. But if you actually talk to ordinary people, those are not the words that are used. And so that's the spirit in which I want to take this forward, that what do we as common ordinary people understand by schooling, learning, reading, and so on. A brief word, I work for a group called Pratham, and we since 2005 have been carrying out an interesting exercise which is called Assa. The acronym actually stands for the Annual Status of Education Report, but as you can see, the acronym means more than that. We hope that what we are doing will it has had some, but we hope it will have more impact at different levels of India. So the exercise is like this, that in every rural district in India, and we have about 575 rural districts in India, every year a sample of villages are chosen, about 30 villages in each district. And in these villages, we go to people's homes, so usually it's done on a Saturday or Sunday, or a Sunday and Monday. And in those households, which are also randomly sampled, you actually ask all children from the age of 5 to 16 to read something which is very simple. So it's not about getting marks, it is not about how you perform in an exam, it's simply the act of reading fluently. And this is deliberately done in the village because there are three kinds of children in India broadly. Children who study in government schools, children who study in private schools, and children who don't go to school at all, but that doesn't mean that they can't read. And so to capture a representative sample of children at the district level, there is no other place to go but to go home. The other advantage of going home or going to the village or going to the community is that while this activity is going on, there is a lot of discussion around the activity of reading, the act of reading. People have many theories, and I often like to think about it that the children are at a certain level and they are very seriously trying to do the task that is given to them. And higher up from them where the adults are, there is lots of discussion, which depending on the state usually starts with blaming. I don't want to get into the blaming because that's a whole other, I think, topic of a seminar about who can be blamed for the status of India. The question is how can we use the experience of today to look forward. So this Assa exercise every year since 2005 has, I think, about between 6 and 7 lakh children across the country who are all rural. And in some past years, actually, Visva-Bharati has been the district partner in Birbhum district. They didn't do it last year, but they have participated in the past. And the other feature of this is that while the design of this exercise is done it's a common exercise, every district in India has a local organization which could be a university, a college, a NGO or a women's group. And in some parts of the northeast like Arunachal, where there is no such organized group, it's often high school students. And over the last 7 years, I've had a lot of opportunity to speak to the young people who participate, and I think it is an experience that actually changes them in some way. Just the simple act of going from village to village with something simple to read and asking children to read. So much of the evidence that I'll show you, hopefully quite quickly, comes from this Assa survey, and it's very, very broad and very basic. So as far as India is concerned, in 2011, almost every child is enrolled in school. We should be happy about that. But the fact is, enrollment, doesn't matter what the technical definition is. Enrollment means the child's name has come to school. It doesn't always mean that the child has come to school, but we still have been able to capture close to almost all children. We have a new right to education law which has come into place a couple of years ago, which guarantees age group education for the age group 6 to 14. And I'm not really sure where this 6 came from, because if you look actually around at who is going to school, we find large numbers of children younger than 6 are in school. And for 2011 actually, if you look across the country, almost 60% of children well before 6 are actually in school. And this has implications of how we treat our children when they come to school. If they want to come to school, I think it's a shame to turn them away. Instead, it's an idea, I think different people have to think about how you turn that entry into a productive experience. I know here in Shantiniketan many things have been done on this, but that's not so usual in most parts of India. So their name has come to school, but are children in school? Numbers vary very much across the states, and you'll see that in the lower part of this slide, there are a large number of states where on a random day if you visit school, 60% or less, which means little under half, I would say around half to 2/3 children are in school, but the others are not in school every day. And this again sort of brings me back yesterday while speakers were speaking about Tagore's early engagement or not with school, that I think in large parts of India, our children do go to school, but the attachment is not very tight. You go to school sometimes, you go to school, probably when something interesting is happening, or your friends go to school, but you don't go to school every day. And that's an assumption that our entire school system is built on, is that everybody is in school almost all the time. Naturally inspired by the reaction of these simple kinds of things to write, this is from a school where standard 1 and 2 children in Sitamarhi district, which is in North Bihar. The little book, very much inspired by Shohaj is called Alu, Malu and Kalu. And it's about a dog, a boy, hunting for potatoes. That's what the story is. Children couldn't read, but when it was read out aloud to them, the instruction that I gave them was, now aap kuch banao. I don't want to say write, I don't want to say draw, because whatever you heard, and amazing pictures came out, which indicated that the children could actually understand everything there was. And I think that therefore, in Shohaj, going back to Shohaj, the role of the illustration, and of very high quality illustration, is really important, because the first impact it has on children is the illustration and of course the content of the story. The reading will come later, but if you don't have this engagement from the children's side, then all this other reading won't come, even if it's grammatically and phonetically very correct. Here's another example. This is from this is actually a very nice block. As Pratham, we always work in this block, and it's not because of the children, because Malihabad and Mal are 2 blocks in Lucknow which have the best mangoes in the country. So if you work there, especially at that time, in addition to having fun with kids, you can also have fun with mangoes. Anyway, so when simple stories are read out to them, and nobody told these children to go and write, but they had this green kind of a blackboard on the walls, and we found that with the simple words, there was a huge mass of children on their own, just writing and creating their own environment in which these things could be there. A last one, and this is an experience of a teacher and a Pratham person in Lucknow district, when they didn't have any simple materials, but they had been part of the process which said, read out to children, get them to talk about it, and then get them to express themselves on paper in whatever way. And this is from the textbook. So, fine, we have a textbook, we can't just completely go away from it, but how do we use it? And so the teacher read out the story, in which it says, at some point I remember it says, Rajkumar Siddharth Bagh mein tehel rahe the. And I remember asking the children, what does tehel mean? Because also tehel is a very simple word compared to Siddharth or some of the other words. And one child said to me, ki bata nahi sakte, par karke dikha sakte. So I said, karke dikhao. So he walked and he said, mote log jab chalte hain to usko tehel kehte hain. And then by the end of this reading this out and discussing it, this is the kind of picture. And if you look at the content and you look at the picture, you can see that the child has completely understood it and also started writing some things, and usually the easier things that they have, which are repeat words in this. So just to end up with, I think we have many, many things to do. And as I was listening to everybody yesterday, I was wondering what you need institutions which support ground level activity. You need campaigns as well. I think if we want the base of the pyramid to enjoy reading, we can't leave it just to schools. You have to flood the environment in different ways. And the word that came to me, and maybe because I listened to a lot of scientists, was climate change of a different type. A climate change with creativity. And people who know Tagore's work much better than I do can perhaps unleash this creativity in simple ways in a far better way. But even if the first chapter of Sahaj Path is able to bring about such a, and not in Bengali, but in languages which are different from Bengali, if it can bring about such a change in mindset, what can you do as individuals, what can you do as Visva-Bharati to actually unleash this kind of thing beyond the boundaries of where we are here today? Going back to, I think, many of the things that Tagore wrote and must have felt, and many of you know much more, about the early years and what children need and how you can get attached. You want to read even if you can't read. You want to draw even if you can't draw, because actually everybody can draw. Reading is a little bit more technical, and drawing everybody can do. How can this be influenced? I know Sahaj Path has been criticized for all kinds of caste and gender and other issues, but it's probably, according to me, the most perfect example of what a child, the first thing if a child reads, if the taste is good, I think you also create a benchmark in children's minds and tongues and hearts that have to be taken further. Yesterday I was talking to a friend saying that I was very nervous about coming here and what should I say. So my friend said it's very simple. It seemed like much earlier great men who were great but also had time to think about education. And some of those great men thought not just about education, but they thought about children from the level of where the children were. Today we still have great men. They don't think about education and they certainly don't think about children. So I think Visva-Bharati has a huge task to change this mindset. I'm sure you'll create many great people, but if we don't think about children and we don't think about what they read, nothing will change in a hurry. Thank you.
Nanjundia. The title of the presentation is Biological Roots of Culture. Vitiana Nanjundia is Professor, Center for Ecological Sciences, Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. His research interests include multicellular development and pattern formation in social amoeba. I invite Professor Vitiana Nanjundia to the dais, please.
Professor Sushanta Dattagupta for having invited me here. I was in a great deal of trepidation. I still am in some degree of trepidation at the thought of speaking to people. At my feelings about the person are one of awe, and it's a strange kind of thought to be standing here speaking on an occasion which is dedicated to celebrating his 150th anniversary and of course the 90th anniversary, as we heard, of the founding of Visva-Bharati. Part of the reason why I feel somewhat awkward at standing and speaking to people at Visva-Bharati is because my image of Shantiniketan, really, which is the way I've grown up thinking about it, and specifically Visva-Bharati, has always been that of the sort of place that I would have liked to go to study, both as a child in school and later on in the university. I come from a background in science, which is to say in natural science, and I think if there's one thing that we've succeeded in doing in this country, it is to have trained at least 2 generations, I think, perhaps 3, of young men and women in the natural sciences, and taken great care to see that they were not contaminated in any way by the humanities. This is a major tragedy. It's a tragedy that we've seen taking place in front of our eyes. But I think Visva-Bharati is one of the places which might help in reversing this trend, at least halting this rather bleak course of events and reversing the trend. Before beginning the talk proper, I'd like to make a specific request to the Upacharya. For many years I've been trying to get hold of Tagore's writings on science, the short booklet that he published. I understand an English translation is not available, and as we were talking yesterday, it turns out that others have had the same experience. So if there is no copyright, and if it's possible for Visva-Bharati to do so, I would really urge you to see whether you can bring it out. It will be a great service to many of us. So with these words by way of background, let me begin what I have to say. As you see, the title of my talk is Biological Roots of Culture. And what I would like to get across in this talk is that the standard way of looking at culture in the broad sense, and I'll illustrate what I mean as we go along, the standard way of looking at culture is that it's a peculiarly human trait or a human attribute, and understanding culture requires understanding human beings as something apart from the rest of the living world. In fact, among sociologists, it's almost taken for granted, I understand, that culture really essentially doesn't exist in other animals, certainly not in the sense that we use the word in the context of humans. So my point here is to just draw your attention to the fact that there is something like culture in other animals, that this thing called culture bears interesting points of resemblance between what we call culture in human beings. And then finally, that knowing, again, as it happens since about 150 years now, knowing that there is a fundamental deep unity in all kinds of life, we should be prepared to find also, in respect of culture, traits in other animals whose understanding might help us to understand human culture. So this is what I'd like to try and get across. In other words, the notion that it's useful to look at cultural trait in other animals to try and see whether we might obtain some insights into understanding culture in human beings. Right. So I start out with this thing which you might call the null hypothesis. I've already stated it. It says that culture is a peculiarly human attribute, and it's made possible by our sensory and motor apparatus, the brain, if you wish, and the neuromuscular system that we have. However, given that it's in some sense rooted in our biology, the null hypothesis goes, the default hypothesis goes, that culture is something that arose with the coming into being of Homo sapiens, with the coming into being of human beings, and therefore it can be studied on its own terms as part of the human condition without any reference, as I said earlier, to other living creatures. So this is the hypothesis which I try to contest. So the title had the words biology and culture, and I'll begin by defining my terms. Biology, very simply put, is the study of living matter. So in a sense, biologists today look upon biology as the study of a kind of matter which is like other kinds of matter. All of us have grown up reading of solids and liquids and gases. It's becoming appreciated now that it's useful to think of the kind of matter that we are formed of, living matter, as some such matter or as some such category along with solids, liquids, gases and so forth, with peculiar properties of its own, to be sure, but no more peculiar than the properties of a liquid are, let's say, vis-a-vis that of a solid. So this is the attitude that one has. In other words, it's a physical system that one is looking at. This is living matter in all its diversity that you see around the world, and this forms the subject matter of biology. It comes in varied sizes, varied shapes, varied colors, varied sorts of behaviors, varied niches or lifestyles, if you wish. What is culture then? Well, this is the definition which I've picked up from a textbook. Culture is defined in different ways by different people, but a common underpinning is that it relates to organized patterns of behavior that you find generally in human beings. And these are patterns of behavior which can be transmitted, which can be passed on from individual to individual or group to group. And the transmission is mediated by the flow of information alone, or by the flow of information and by the transmission of artifacts of material entities. So culture can pass in both ways. Right. So let's look at a few examples of what one would call culture or cultural traits in a human context, but found in animals. So these are a pair of zebra finches, birds that sing. They are among the group of birds that are called songbirds. And these bird songs, in addition to being pleasing to the human ear, are one things pleasing to the bird ear as well. And there are aspects of these songs that are rather interesting. Birds have an innate component to their song, and usually it's a male bird that sings, so it's zebra finch as well. They have an innate component to their song, but in addition to that, for them to sing the song in all its subtlety, they have to be trained, and here training is by and large passive. It consists of listening on the part of a juvenile bird to the fully formed adult song sung usually by its parent or by some other male in the neighborhood. So there's an element of training. In addition to this, there are variations in song within the same species. Generally, the song is typical of a species. So here we are speaking of zebra finch, which has many species within it. In addition to this species-specific nature of the song, there are what are called song dialects, which are region-specific. So even within a given species, groups of birds which inhabit a certain area and by and large breed amongst themselves have modifications in this song, variations imposed on the basic species specific song, which are native to that group alone. So if a bird migrates from its region to some other region, it has to learn to speak, or in this case sing, in the new dialect that it is exposed to. So you can see there's an element of transmission here. By the way, both of these birds are Indian birds, so it might be fun for those of you who during your wanderings come across, you might happen to come across them to take a look. So this is the great crested grebe, and what's happening here is a rather elaborate courtship dance between the male and the female, and the dance consists of the two coming face to face with each other. These are water birds, so swimming to face each other, then dipping in the water, raising their beak, then turning the head first to the left and then to the right, and it's almost as if it's choreographed. And somewhere towards the end of the dance, there is this ritual offering of gifts. I come to the word ritual presently in a different context. Ritual offering of gift, which is really seaweed or waterweed or whatever it is, they use as nesting material. So this is a practical gift that's offered. So they have dance. So it was invented by the ants roughly 50 million years ago, so which is to say about 50 million years before us. And what these are rather complex fields of fungi which are raised by ants, which go out, capture these fungi, bring them back, prepare moist soil on which to grow the fungi, and in addition, in some cases, go to the extent of also using pesticides in the form of live bacteria which they bring over, and the bacteria make antibiotics to prevent other bacteria or other fungi from contaminating these fungus gardens. And of course, the fungus gardens are there to provide food for the growing larvae. So this is rather systematic farming of plants practiced by these ants and invented a long time ago. Architecture, if you wish, again, this is one of our birds. This is the Baya weaver bird constructing its nest, and these nests come in a variety of modifications over a basic style or basic plan. Large amount of design elements go into this. And what's interesting about the Baya weaver bird's nest is that the nest has to really satisfy rather stringent design criteria, and the person who decides whether the criteria are satisfied or not is the female bird. It's the male that builds the nest. Then the female has to come, inspect it. Quite often she does it in a very violent way by pecking at it and so on to see whether it stands up to her assaults. And it's only the best nests that are accepted then, of course, for raising a family. Social behavior. This happens to be an organism that I work with. This is a microorganism, in fact, an amoeba. So that's an amoeba sitting there. And the small dots you see around the amoeba are small bacteria on which the amoeba feeds. And here something rather interesting happens. As the amoeba feeds on these bacteria, it divides into 2 and then 4 and 8 and so forth. And pretty soon you have a very large colony of amoebae. Now, once the colony has exhausted all the food around there, it can't feed anymore. And now it decides that the only way to withstand this stress, and this is the stress of starvation, is to get together. And here you see the manner in which they get together. What these amoebae do is to send rhythmic, which is to say periodic signals to one another, and as a result of these signals move towards common collecting points, and the shapes in which they do so can be rather varied. You see spiral shapes there, you can get concentric shapes and so forth. So this is a sort of rhythmic dance which brings them all together and they aggregate, and having aggregated they go on to do something else, which is to build a multicellular body and a stress-resistant form, which is called
It's Provina Shrumik, former principal of Bhavan, Sri Shukriyo Tagore, and with his permission, I'd like to begin the proceedings. Our first speaker for this session is Professor Partho Ghosh. The title of his presentation is Aspects of the Musical Creativity of Rabindranath Tagore. Dr. Partho Ghosh is a senior scientist and Platinum Jubilee Fellow, National Academy of Sciences, India. He is also attached to the Center for Astroparticle Physics and Space Science, Bose Institute, Kolkata. Of course, we claim Partho as our own since he has taught at Visva-Bharati also. I would like to invite Professor Partho Ghosh to the stage.
It's a great pleasure and honor for me to be here. I have been associated with this great institution, or I got associated with this great institution way back in 1968. And I taught here for 7.5 years. And since then, it has entered my soul. And I've never been actually able to leave. So when I come here, I feel I'm back home. So today my lecture is on Tagore's musical creativity, a few unique aspects. It will be an illustrated talk. I will not sing, but you will hear some music. The essential hallmark of Tagore is creativity of an amazing order. His creations have an extraordinary aesthetic sensibility, and that is nowhere more evident than in his songs. In his Bhumika, or introduction to Gitobitan, the complete collection of all his songs, he says about his own song, Bohu janotar majhe apurbo eka, captivating and on its own among a multitude. It is impossible to go into a comprehensive treatment of this outpouring of creative energy across nearly 70 decades in half an hour. So I have chosen to limit myself to only a few aspects of it that I find fascinating. Let me start by emphasizing the role of tradition in creativity. No genuine and persistent creation is possible without a traditional base, for novelty can only be judged relative to established cultural norms. I quote, "Tradition is a matter of much wider significance. It cannot be inherited, and if you want it, you must obtain it by great labor. It involves in the first place the historical sense, which we may call nearly indispensable to anyone who would continue to be a poet beyond his 25th year. And the historical sense involves a perception not only of the pastness of the past, but of its presence. The historical sense compels a man to write not merely with his own generation in his bones, but with a feeling the whole of the literature of Europe from Homer, and within it the whole of the literature of his own country, has a simultaneous existence and composes a simultaneous order. The historical sense, which is a sense of the timeless as well as of the temporal, and of the timeless and the temporal together, is what makes a writer traditional. And it is at the same time what makes a writer most acutely conscious of his place in time, of his contemporaneity. This is from his tradition and the individual talent. Hence, creativity requires a profound and critical understanding of tradition. Tagore was born into and grew up in a rich tradition of Indian classical music, namely Dhrupa. Great singers of the Vishnupur Gharana were engaged as tutors of the Tagore family in Jodhpur. He was also exposed to Khyal, Toppa, Kirtan and the folk music of Bengal, particularly the songs of the Bauls of East Bengal. He had the gift to penetrate right into the heart of these forms, often obscured by unnecessary embellishments. He discerned quite clearly what the limitations of these traditional forms were. To the quintessential poet that he was, Hindustani classical music was singularly lacking in poetry, whereas words and poetry appeared to dominate Bengali songs. The poet and aesthete in him rebelled. He proceeded to correct this imbalance. Here is an example of how creatively he used, sorry, I will skip this because otherwise I'll never finish. He was also exposed to Western music. from his childhood. His brother Jyotirindranath used to play the piano quite well. In my reminiscences, he writes, and I quote, "My brother at one time would spend days at his piano, engrossed in the creation of many tunes. Showers of melody would stream from under his dancing fingers, while Akhay Babu and I, seated on either side, would be busy fitting words to the tunes as they grew into shape to help to hold them in our memories. This is how I served my apprenticeship in the composition of songs." Unquote. Then he went to England at the age of 17. There he was exposed firsthand to Irish and Scottish melodies, a few of which he even adapted in some of his early songs. But he was soon disappointed by their sweet mournfulness. He was also exposed to Western classical music, which he found very attractive. Again, in my reminiscences, he writes, and I quote, I cannot claim that I gained admittance to the soul of European music, but what little of it I came to understand from the outside attracted me greatly in one way. It seemed so romantic. It is somewhat difficult to analyze what I mean by the word. What I would refer to is the aspect of variety, of abundance, of the waves on the sea of life, of the ever-changing light and shade on their ceaseless undulations. There is the opposite aspect of pure extension, of the unwinking blue of the sky, of the silent hint of immeasurability in the distant circle of the horizon. However that may be, let me repeat at the risk of not being perfectly clear that whenever I have been moved by European music, I have said to myself, it is romantic. It is translating into melody the evanescence of life. Not that we wholly lack the same attempt in some forms of our music, but it is less pronounced, less successful. Our melodies give voice to the star-spangled night, to the first reddening of dawn. They speak of the sky-pervading sorrow, which lures in the darkness of clouds, the speechless, deep intoxication of the forest-roaming spring, unquote. Having thus identified exactly the strengths and weaknesses in both European and Indian music, he proceeded to create a new musical genre that would combine the strengths of the two traditions. Another idea played a key role in his creations. Again, in his My Reminiscences, he writes, quote, I had read in some work of Herbert Spencer's that speech takes on tuneful inflection whenever emotion comes into play. It is a fact that the tone or tune is as important to us as the spoken word for the expression of anger, sorrow, joy, and wonder. Spencer's idea that through a development of these emotional modulations of voice, man found music appealed to me. Why should it not do, I thought to myself, to act a drama in a kind of recitative based on this idea, unquote. Now this, you will admit, is a very new use of the Raga Desh. Now, encouraged by the success of Valmiki Pratibha, he composed another musical play of the same type, Kal Mrigoya. Then he writes in his reminiscences, quote, "The enthusiasm which went to the making of Valmiki Pratibha and Kal Mrigoya, I have never felt for any other work of mine. In these two, the creative musical impulse of the time found expression." Unquote. Now, one finds more mature expressions of this essential feature, the loosening of Indian classical melodic forms from their traditional fetters for the purpose of drama, in his dance drama, later dance dramas such as Mayar Khala, Shama, Chitrangada, Chondalika, etc. Now let me point out one more aspect of his songs before ending. I have no doubt in my mind that Western harmony had entered his soul in a profound way and stirred his creative genius. Eliot has suggested a scientific analogy to illustrate this kind of creativity, that of a catalyst, such as a bit of finely filiated platinum in a chamber containing oxygen and sulfur dioxide, culminating in sulfurous acid. Eliot writes, quote, "This combination takes place only if the platinum is present. Nevertheless, the newly formed acid contains no trace of platinum, and the platinum itself is apparently unaffected, has remained inert, neutral, and unchanged. The mind of the poet is the shred of platinum. It may partly or exclusively operate upon the experience of the man himself, but the more perfect the artist, the more completely separate in him will be the man who suffers and the mind which creates. The more perfectly will the mind digest and transmute the passions which are its material." Unquote. I believe that Tagore transmuted Indian melodic forms and Western harmony, the passions and materials presented to his catalytic mind, into a new musical creation, which remains the most aesthetic fusion of East and West, something that was entirely lacking in pre-Tagore music across the world. Of course, now fusion has become so common, but they don't realize that it all started with this great man. And nobody has succeeded in doing it so perfectly as Tagore, even today. As Rudyard Kipling wrote in his famous ballad of East and West, "Oh, East is East, and West is West, and never the twain shall meet, till earth and sky stand presently at God's great judgment seat." But what the people don't quote are the next two lines. "But there is neither East nor West, border nor breed nor birth, when two strong men stand face to face, though they come from the ends of the earth." Now, I will play a few orchestral pieces for you, which I hope will illustrate the underlying harmony in many of Rabindranath's songs. I'll just let me say one or two words so that I'm not misunderstood. This harmony remains implicit and unstated in his compositions. When you listen to his compositions, you feel they are very much Indian. But if your ears are trained to Western music, you will immediately hear the harmony behind it. And I dare say that the way that his musical phrasings are constructed clearly show that this harmony was playing maybe in his subconscious If Dr. Kakar is here, he might be able to tell us more about the subconscious. Now, one way to make this harmony that I have in mind explicit is through orchestral compositions. Now, often people use orchestra with the songs, and that often at the hands of incompetent arrangers actually try to dominate and spoil the great aesthetic beauty of the songs. This is my feeling. I don't know whether you will agree with me. That doesn't mean that very sensitive orchestration is not possible. In fact, Rabindranath himself had requested Professor Danelu to do some of these orchestrations, and these have been preserved, though very few people know how sensitively Professor Danelu did those orchestral accompaniments for his songs. I had the fortune of hearing that in Kolkata the other day. But the other problem is that sometimes people just play the orchestra, some song with some instruments. That also seems a bit pointless, because the words are not there. And the words, as I have said, it's a balance of the words and the music which makes Rabindra Sangeet. So if the words are not there, then just the playing the tune may be all right, but it misses the heart. That's not Rabindranath. On the other hand, it is possible to do inspired orchestral creations based on his songs, which would not be just playing the songs, but compositions which you can say are inspired by Rabindranath. Again, we are going into a new kind of creativity. If people are creative and if they are knowledgeable, then they can do wonders. So I'm going to play a few samples of some experiments which have been done. And it's for you to judge whether they have been successful or failures. You will not be hearing just the songs, but you will be hearing some orchestra which would remind you of the songs, but at the same time which will show the underlying harmonic structure of these compositions. Can I have track 2? Identify the song. And I'm sure you heard the harmony. Track 1.
happening to you that you never reckoned would. I'd like to speak about some random thoughts on art, beauty, performance, before I get into a small AV on Kalakshetra, which was my brief. Dr. Ananda Kumaraswamy in The Dance of Shiva said, "Each race contributes something essential to the world's civilization in the course of its own self-expression and self-realization. The character built up in solving its own problems, in the experience of its own misfortunes, is itself a gift which each country offers to the world. The essential contribution of India, then, is simply her Indianness. Her great humiliation would be to substitute or to have substituted for this own character or svabhava a cosmopolitan veneer, for indeed then she must come before the world empty-handed." Unquote. Whatever we do offer the world is so surely marked both positively and negatively by who we are. It is individual enough for it to possess this svabhava. So where does this Indianness or svabhava come from? Perhaps from our philosophy. We have a philosophy that is unique and which I think tends to wash over all of us, or can wash over us irrespective of our individual faiths. It also washes over whatever it is that we are doing, bearing upon that in a very distinctive way, however distant that work is from being Indian. This can be said to be a collective sanskara, something we inherit unconsciously and by virtue of the fact that we are Indian. Somewhere at the back of our minds, we believe in the essential unity of all life, in eternity, in compassion and intolerance. And strangely, in spite of a new skepticism and disillusionment with religion, yet from generation to generation, there is a constant endeavor among people to understand the meaning of these truths. Even if it is not apparent, at some point in one's life, it gains significance. We want to understand the ultimate purpose of our lives, to know what righteous living means, to understand the real meaning of compassion, the purpose of art, and the value of harmony in our lives. This svabhava comes from a conscious and more often than not, an unconscious acceptance of these truths. In some of us, the Indianness shows less than in others, but it is there, unmistakably. Some amongst us are even embarrassed by our svabhava and believe that to be progressive is to shun it, to adopt the universal image, so that we may be accepted easily by a world community. Does a denial of who we are really make us more acceptable? I'm not so sure. Be that as it may, and in spite of the very enviable collective sanskara we are said to possess, we are mostly unmindful of the value of life and live in constant states of confusion and harmony and disharmony, both within ourselves and in the society that we are part of. Perhaps what we mean by unity in diversity is that every person, thing or action is dependent upon another. This is true for almost nothing is possible in India without many little and big wheels turning simultaneously or one after another. Preferably with the big wheel dictating how the small one will turn, or when it will, or if at all. You only have to look at our stories to know how complicated and convoluted our concept of the truth is and the fertility of our imagination. In the epics of India, at first glance, the Indian incidents seem to be like yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Actually, in time-space, it is more like one lifetime, or even larger, an avatar or a yuga that separates the incidents. This is us. In the West, where there is the fabled old man time, but even he does not quite live up to our distant spaces of time. Films that suggest the crossing over to the other world and back again have only just started finding expression. Suggestions that the relationship continues where it left off in a last life, or the suggestion of paying one's dues from previous lives, these are yet to come. The new Hollywood blockbusters still do not compare in range and flight to the imagination of the Mahabharata or the Puranic tales. Only recently, the Harry Potter series are giving us a run for our money, and understandably so, they are so unreal. So where does that leave us? Where is our svabhava to be found in all these dichotomies, in these stories within stories? I think many of us see ourselves as the heroes and heroines of these mythological fables and types thereof, without the sacrifice they made or the feats they performed, of course. Yet the Sati Savitri image is still alive, and so too the Draupadis and the Sitas, the Ramas and the Ravanas. Our longest running serials are either the epics themselves or variations of them. We live on fantasy, on the unreal, on make-believe, or what we wish to be, not who we really are. This, of course, is an actor-dancer's delight. Such an amazing wealth of narrative available at one's fingertips and audiences who understand the nuances of it as well. In such a scenario, what does the actor who presumably reflects or comments upon this complex society do? In theatre, they do the story or parts thereof, or they do a take on it, which is either hilarious or pathetic or blasphemous or bold or different. In music, they feed the story nostalgic parampara, convention, sampradaya, school, purana, received practice, or riti rivas, customs and manners that were in use. In the post-colonial period, he suggested that a newly defined tradition may well have come as a boon to the westernized urban Indian elite and represented a power block. Aligning with tradition was a means of self-inscription into the body politic of an emerging nation-state. To proclaim you were traditional meant you legitimately claim power in the present due to your endorsement of the past. He summed up in words of caution, though, by quoting Kalidasa's quotes, "Just because something is deemed ancient does not automatically render it sound and impeccable. The wise explore and accept each new idea on its own merit. It is only the unenlightened who seek security in old and accepted convention." As a child in Kalakshetra, we were introduced to every religion in the world. My guru and the founding members of the institute were theosophists who believed in the truth of every religion. Our learning of traditional arts of dance and music perforce dictated that in spite of this universal study of religion, yet there was a concentration of the spirit of Hinduism. Secularists must accept the plurality and multiplicity of India's traditions, including the multiple religious faiths that our soil is blessed with. Our traditions are very precious, not to be wiped out of educational curriculum only because they have a certain religious coloring. I am more secular in the most universal way possible because I have a Christian mother, a Jewish father, a theosophist for a guru, a Western education, and practice a Hindu art form. No one can take that away from me, and it was possible because I was born in India. Being in the arts, one cannot deny the advantage of learning an art from the early stage of one's consciousness. Our crafts, our songs, our languages, our food, these nuances in our lives come early. Our craftspersons teach their children their trade. This does not mean they are being exploited. It also does not mean that they must be denied a normal education. It only means that the child is capable of absorbing both, capable of being both scientific as well as artistic, of being logical as well as creative. Any mother knows that a skill taught early is learnt easily. The best face of our traditions, their creative, dynamic, and generative element, have to be recovered. When the secularist stands vociferously opposed to the vocationalization of education, I must ask whether they believe that all artisans and artists of this country possess vocational skills only for the market. Are we humans capable of evolving, morally and ethically? Or are we all on this huge roller coaster ride that takes us round and round and back again, churning up for 1 trillion years, for all time perhaps a world of hatred and anger? Often in the past decade, one has wondered what it is that wipes out all rationale in the educated mind. Who is responsible for all that is happening to our world? Is it just various groups of people with unchangeable political ideologies? Is it the same one that was revealed to be by my dedicated teachers, by loving friends, by honest parents, by exciting journeys and happy encounters, where all this that is beautiful in life and in living was made apparent through the experience of it? That world came in the form of poetry and music, nature and animals, books and children, but also from the loving care of servants who shared our food, our sorrows, and our laughter. And while we brought them into our world of privilege, we never failed to peek into their world of deprivation, however humble. It taught us to respect their simple ways, their humility and their great pride, their philosophy and their humor. What is this price we are paying for this fragile secularism that we boast of? If we do not begin to teach philosophy in our schools, if we do not celebrate the unique character of multiple religions and identities, if we do not begin to sing our national anthem with more vigor and with a tear in our eyes, perhaps it is time to arise from this slumber and turn what is fashionable around, else the dance will still and the music will ebb from our lips and our hearts. A firm but loving voice of sanity perhaps is missing in our lives, and it has to be our own. The greatest men, the gentlest of souls like Tagore have spoken and left our world. One wants to tell oneself that what is happening today does not matter, but it does. It shakes our foundations, it affects our priorities. The only thing that really matters at the end of the day is the glow of trust in the eyes of a child. What matters is that beauty is appreciated and that traditions are respected, that every religious leader shouts out from his pulpit that there is good in all faiths and that every man believes this to be true. That as long as there is tolerance, as long as there is an appreciation of another man's suffering, of nature's unfair hand, there is hope. I'd now like to just, the great masters from there, they all dialogued at some period of time. This is the great banyan tree that was transferred, a sapling was transferred from Adyar, from the Theosophical Society to Tiruvanmiyur, where we now live, and in 40 odd years it's grown to this beautiful size. It's where we have our morning prayer. Life in Kalakshetra is simple, it's ashramic. Children come from all over the world, but they conform to a particular way of life that